Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 12 of our complete practice question series for the DVA-C02 AWS Certified Developer Associate exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends, then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 12. Question number 448. A media archive stores individual video objects averaging 2.5 terabytes. For the first 90 days, each video must be available with immediate retrieval. After 90 days, retrieval can take longer than 10 minutes, and storage cost should be minimized. Which design meets the requirement? Option A. Store videos in EFS standard and transition them to EFS standard IA. Option B. Store videos in S3 Glacier instant retrieval for 90 days, then transition them to S3 Glacier flexible retrieval. Option C. Store videos in S3 Glacier Deep Archive during the first 90 days, then move them to flexible retrieval. Option D. Store videos on EBS for 90 days, then copy them to S3 Glacier Deep Archive. The correct answer is B. Store videos in S3 Glacier instant retrieval for 90 days, then transition them to S3 Glacier flexible retrieval. Here is why. Instant retrieval provides millisecond access for rarely accessed objects during the first period. Flexible retrieval lowers later storage cost when delayed restores are acceptable. Why are the other options not correct? A. EFS is a higher cost shared file system for large archival objects. C. Deep Archive cannot provide instant access during the first 90 days. D. EBS is unnecessary block storage and adds migration and volume operations. Exam tip. Select S3 archival classes by both retrieval latency and the age-based access pattern. Question number 449. A provision kinesis data stream has enough shards for normal ingestion but becomes slow during a tested and measurable peak period. The developer wants to add only the capacity needed for that peak while retaining provision mode cost control. Which action should the developer take? Option A. Reduce the stream retention period. Option B. Install KPL without changing insufficient stream capacity. Option C. Increase the shard count by calling update shard count. Option D. Switch permanently to on-demand mode and rely only on a partition key. The correct answer is C. Increase the shard count by calling update shard count. Here is why. In provision mode, aggregate stream throughput is the sum of shard capacity. Increasing the shard count adds the known peak capacity while retaining shard-based billing. Why are the other options not correct? A. Retention duration does not increase ingestion throughput. B. KPL can aggregate producer records but cannot replace insufficient stream capacity. D. On-demand mode removes shard planning but is not necessarily the lowest cost choice for a measurable provisioned workload. Exam tip. Scale a provision kinesis stream by increasing shards and distribute partition keys to avoid hot shards. Question number 450. S3 buckets containing user data exist in several regions. The security team needs managed sensitive data discovery, and all resulting finding events must be routed to a central processing location in EUS2 with minimal custom code. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Enable MACI in the required regions and use event bridge rules to route MACI finding events to a central event bus or target in EUS2. Option B. Use Inspector to scan the S3 objects and copy findings through Event Bridge. Option C. Write a Lambda-sensitive data scanner and store custom findings in an EUS2 bucket. Option D. Publish MACI findings to CloudTrail and replicate the trail as the finding transport. The correct answer is A. Enable MACI in the required regions and use Event Bridge rules to route MACI finding events to a central event bus or target in EUS2. Here is why. MACI performs managed sensitive data discovery for S3 and publishes findings to Event Bridge, which can route events to centralized cross-region processing. Why are the other options not correct? B. Inspector assesses workloads and software vulnerabilities rather than S3 sensitive data. C. A custom scanner creates substantial development and maintenance. D. A CloudTrail is an AWS API audit log, not MACI's finding publication channel. Exam tip. Macy is regional, enable and configure it where the buckets reside, then centralize findings through EventBridge or Security Hub. Question number 451. A multilingual media service must return different content according to each viewer's country and preferred browser language. The service needs a globally distributed entry point with reliable, low-latency delivery, while the origin selects the correct content. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Place the content in one S3 bucket, enable transfer acceleration, and use Route 53. Geolocation and geoproximity records for the bucket endpoint. Option B. Put CloudFront in front of the application and forward accept language and CloudFront viewer country to the origin. Option C. Put AWS WAF in front of API gateway and use geographic and regex rules to allow or block locale-specific requests. Option D. Put API gateway behind global accelerator and create separate accelerator listeners for each country and language. The correct answer is B. Put CloudFront in front of the application and forward accept language in CloudFront viewer country to the origin. Here is why. CloudFront provides globally distributed low-latency delivery. The forwarded language and country values let the origin select the appropriate localized response. Why are the other options not correct? A. S3 transfer acceleration improves uploads and Route 53 does not forward language data. C. WAF filters requests, it is not a content localization mechanism. D. Global accelerator listeners are based on protocol and port, not country and language. Exam tip. Use CloudFront viewer headers and request headers when an origin must personalize content by geography and language. Question number 452. A company imports third-party TLS certificates into ACM. The security mailbox, subscribed to an SNS topic, must receive a notification 90 days before an imported certificate expires. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Configure the AWS Config ACM certificate expiration check managed rule with a 90-day threshold, then route that rule's compliance change events through EventBridge to the SNS topic. Option B. Create only an EventBridge rule for ACM certificate approaching expiration events and use the SNS topic as the target without changing the account expiration event setting. Option C. Run a Lambda certificate search and send the results only to an SQS. Option D. Start a step functions workflow from a CloudTrail certificate expiration notification and place the result only in SQS. The correct answer is A. Configure the AWS Config ACM certificate expiration check managed rule with a 90-day threshold, then route that rule's compliance change events through EventBridge to the SNS topic. Here is why. The config rule evaluates imported ACM certificates against the specified days to expiration value. EventBridge can route a NON_compliant change to the subscribed SNS topic. Why are the other options not correct? B. ACM expiration events begin 45 days before expiry by default, not 90 days. C. Sending only to SQS does not notify the subscribed email address. D. CloudTrail does not emit certificate expiration notifications. Exam tip. Use the configurable AWS config expiration rule when the alert window differs from ACM's default EventBridge expiration window. Question number 453. A developer has an AWS Lambda function that needs to access an Amazon DynamoDB table named daily orders. The Lambda function must be able to perform read operations on the table. The Lambda function must not be able to perform write operations on the table. The developer needs to create an IAM policy to associate with the Lambda function's execution role. Which IAM policy statement will meet these requirements? Version: October 17, 2012. Statement: Effect: Allow. Action: DynamoDB. Batch get item: DynamoDB. Get item: DynamoDB. Query: DynamoDB. Scan: batch retal item: DynamoDB. DynamoDB. Put item: DynamoDB. Update item: L. ARN AWS DynamoDB EU East 1:321456987012. Table/daily orders. Resource. Version. October 17, 2012. Statement. Effect. Allow. Action. DynamoDB get item. DynamoDB put item. DynamoDB query. DynamoDB scan. L. Table/daily orders. Resource. ARN AWS DynamoDB EU East 1:321456987012. Version. October 17, 2012. Statement. Effect. Deny. Action. DynamoDB query. DynamoDB scan. DynamoDB put item. DynamoDB update item. Table/daily orders. Resource. ARN AWS DynamoDB EU East 1:321456987012. Version. October 17, 2012. Statement. Effect. Allow. Action. DynamoDB batch get item. DynamoDB get item. DynamoDB query. DynamoDB scan. L. EU East 1:321456987012 Table/daily orders. Resource. ARN AWS DynamoDB. The correct answer is D. Allow only DynamoDB batch get item, DynamoDB get item, DynamoDB query, and DynamoDB scan on the daily orders table. Here is why. These are read-only DynamoDB operations. Option D grants the Lambda execution role permission to retrieve and search data from the specified table without allowing modifications. Why are the other options not correct? A. Includes batch write item, put item, and update item, which permit data changes. B. Includes put item, so the function could create or replace table items. C. Uses deny for both read and write operations, so the function could not read the table. Exam tip. For DynamoDB read-only access, grant only operations such as getItem, batch getItem, query, and scan. Avoid put item, update item, delete item, and batch write item. Question number 454. A developer needs a built-in JWT authorization mechanism for an API route named /auth. The solution must not contain a custom authorizer function. Which API gateway configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Create an HTTP API and protect /auth with a Lambda authorizer. Option B. Create a WebSocket API and attach a Lambda authorizer to /auth. Option C. Create an HTTP API, configure a JWT authorizer, attach it to /auth, and deploy the API. Option D. Create a WebSocket API and attach a JWT authorizer to /auth. The correct answer is C. Create an HTTP API, configure a JWT authorizer, attach it to /auth, and deploy the API. Here is why. API Gateway HTTP APIs provide a built-in JWT authorizer that validates issuer, audience, scopes, and token claims without custom Lambda code. Why are the other options not correct? A. A Lambda authorizer introduces custom code. B. It also uses custom logic and WebSocket route semantics. D. API Gateway's built-in JWT authorizer is an HTTP API feature, not a WebSocket API authorizer. Exam tip. Choose an HTTP API JWT authorizer for native OAuth 2.0 or OIDC JWT validation. Question number 455. A social application accepts 10 megabytes video uploads. After each upload, a worker must receive a queue message containing enough information to retrieve the file within 5 minutes. The design should minimize cost. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Store each file on a general-purpose EEB South volume and place the volume location in SQS. Option B. Put the complete 10 megabytes video in the SQS message body. Option C. Archive the file immediately in S3 Glacier Deep Archive and place its location in SQS. Option D. Store the file in S3 Standard and send its bucket and object key in the SQS message. The correct answer is D. Store the file in S3 Standard and send its bucket and object key in the SQS message. Here is why. S3 standard provides immediate object access, while the small SQS pointer avoids placing a 10 MB payload beyond the SQS message size limit. Why are the other options not correct? A. EBS is instance attached block storage and adds cost in coupling. B. The video is too large for an SQS message. C. Deep archive cannot restore the object within 5 minutes. Exam tip. Store large payloads in S3 and send an object reference through SQS. Question number 456. A Lambda function has immutable production and development versions. The team needs a staging alias that invokes both the production version and a candidate version during validation. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. To create a weighted alias whose primary version is production and whose additional version is the candidate. Option B. Add a tag containing both version numbers to the unqualified function. Option C. Register both Lambda versions as network load balancer targets. Option D. Use a code deploy linear deployment without creating the staging alias. The correct answer is A. Create a weighted alias whose primary version is production and whose additional version is the candidate. Here is why. A weighted alias presents one stable ARN and distributes invocations between two published versions according to configured weights. Why are the other options not correct? B. Tags do not route Lambda invocations. C. Network load balancers do not directly target Lambda versions. D. Code deploy can automate traffic shifting, but it does not itself create the requested persistent staging alias configuration. Exam tip. A Lambda alias can split traffic between one primary version and one additional version. Question number 457. An order workflow uses separate Lambda functions for validation, payment, inventory, and fulfillment. Every function must start only after the preceding step completes. Which solution provides the required sequencing with the least operational overhead? Option A. Publish all steps to SNS and rely on subscription filters to establish order. Option B. Define a step function state machine that invokes the functions in the required sequence. Option C. Place step messages in a standard SQS queue and allow all functions to pull it. Option D. Create separate event bridge scheduler schedules for the workflow steps. The correct answer is B. Define a step function state machine that invokes the functions in the required sequence. Here is why. Step functions provides managed workflow state, ordered Lambda tasks, retries, branching, and error handling without custom coordination infrastructure. Why are the other options not correct? A. SNS fanout invokes subscribers independently rather than sequentially. C. A standard queue does not assign different ordered steps to specific functions. D. Independent schedules do not coordinate completion or failures. Exam tip. Use step functions when Lambda tasks must execute in a controlled workflow order. Question number 458. A mobile application displays private S3 images. Users must sign in through login with Amazon or supported social identity providers, and the application needs temporary AWS credentials after authentication. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Embed an IAM access key and secret key in the mobile application. Option B. Call STS assume role directly from unauthenticated client code. Option C. Use Amazon Cognito identity pools with Web Identity Federation. Option D. Use SAML Federation for consumer social identities. The correct answer is C. Use Amazon Cognito identity pools with Web Identity Federation. Here is why. Cognito identity pools accept identities from login with Amazon and supported social providers and exchange them for temporary role credentials to access S3. Why are the other options not correct? A. Embedded long-term keys are insecure. B. Untrusted mobile code cannot safely assume an arbitrary role without a federated trust flow. D. SAML is primarily for enterprise identity providers, not consumer social sign-in. Exam tip. Use Cognito identity pools when federated application users need temporary AWS credentials. Question number 459. SNS asynchronously invokes a Lambda function. An SQS queue must receive a Lambda invocation. Record after every completed invocation, whether the function succeeds or ultimately fails. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A, configure the SQSQ only as the function's dead letter Q. Option B, add send message code at the end of the handler. Option C, configure only an onSuccess lambda destination to the SQSQ. Option D, configure both onSuccess and onFailure asynchronous destinations to the SQSQ and alarm on destination delivery failures. The correct answer is D, configure both onSuccess and onFailure asynchronous destinations to the SQSQ and alarm on destination delivery failures. Here is why. SNS invokes lambda asynchronously. The two destinations deliver an invocation record after either final success or final failure, covering every completed invocation outcome. Why are the other options not correct? A. A DLQ receives only events discarded after failed retries. B. Code at the handler's end does not run for timeouts or unhandled failures. C. An onSuccess destination omits failed invocations. Exam tip. Configure both asynchronous destination outcomes when downstream auditing must capture successes and failures. Question number 460. Before uploading a 3 MB sensitive JSON document to S3, a Lambda function must encrypt the document inside the function rather than relying only on S3 server-side encryption. Which implementation meets the requirement? Option A, reference the default S3 KMS key in the function without performing a cryptographic operation. Option B, a call KMS generate data key, encrypt the document locally with the plaintext data key, and store the encrypted data key with the ciphertext. Option C, call generate data key on an S3 managed key. Option D, specify a customer managed KMS key only as an S3 upload parameter. The correct answer is B, call KMS generate data key, encrypt the document locally with the plaintext data key, and store the encrypted data key with the ciphertext. Here is why. Envelope encryption uses a data key for the 3 MB payload and preserves the KMS encrypted copy needed to decrypt the document later. Why are the other options not correct? A. Naming a key does not encrypt the local file. C. SSS3 keys cannot be used with KMS generate data key. D. An S3 KMS upload setting encrypts the object at the service, not before upload. Exam tip. Use KMS data keys for client-side encryption of payloads larger than KMS direct encryption limits. Question number 461. A Lambda workload requires predictable startup latency. A specified number of execution. Environments must complete runtime and function initialization before requests arrive. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A, invoke the function every minute with event bridge to keep environments warm. Option B, maximize reserved concurrency and perform setup manually. Option C, publish a function version or use an alias, then configure the required provisioned concurrency. Option D, reduce the deployment package size without pre-initializing execution environments. The correct answer is C, publish a function version or use an alias, then configure the required provisioned concurrency. Here is why. Provisioned concurrency creates initialized execution environments in advance and runs environment and function initialization before requests arrive. Why are the other options not correct? A. Scheduled warming is not deterministic and does not cover every scaling event. B. Reserved concurrency does not pre-initialize environments. D. Optimization can shorten cold starts but cannot provide the required prepared capacity. Exam tip. Provisioned concurrency provides predictable Lambda startup latency for a configured version or alias. Question number 462. CloudFormation deploys a Lambda zip archive from S3. The developer repeatedly overwrites the object at the same bucket and key, but stack updates do not update the function code. What should the developer change before the next stack update? Option A, upload the archive under a new S3 key or reference a new S3 object version in the template. Option B, move the unchanged object key to another bucket. Option C, create a Lambda alias before updating the stack. Option D, attach a code signing configuration without changing the code location. The correct answer is A. Upload the archive under a new S3 key or reference a new S3 object version in the template. Here is why. CloudFormation updates Lambda code only when a code property changes. A new S3 key or S3 object version makes the artifact change visible to the stack. Why are the other options not correct? B. Merely changing buckets is unnecessary unless the template value changes appropriately. C. Aliases route versions and do not detect overwritten deployment objects. D. Code signing validates packages but does not trigger a code update. Exam tip. Version Lambda artifacts and change S3 key or S3 object version on each CloudFormation deployment. Question number 463. Several EC2 applications must consume the same real-time data stream independently. Each consumer needs checkpoints and replay after interruption, and additional consumers should not require duplicate producer rights. Which service meets the requirement? Option A, Amazon SQS. Option B, Amazon Data Firehose. Option C, Amazon EventBridge. Option D, Amazon Kinesis Data Streams. The correct answer is D, Amazon Kinesis Data Streams. Here is why. Multiple consumer applications can independently process retained stream records in real time and resume from their own checkpoints without duplicate producer streams. Why are the other options not correct? A. Consumers of one SQS queue compete for messages. B. Firehose delivers records to destinations and is not a replayable multi-consumer stream. C. EventBridge routes events but does not provide shard-style ordered retention and consumer checkpointing. Exam tip. Use Kinesis data streams for replayable real-time records consumed independently by multiple applications. Question number 464. A CloudFormation parameter named environment accepts dev, test, or prod. A mapping named environment data stores a timeout value for each environment. The Lambda timeout property must use the value associated with the selected environment. Which YAML expression performs the lookup? Option A timeout, get ATT, environment data, ref environment, timeout. Option B a timeout, select, environment data, ref environment, timeout. Option C timeout, find in map, environment data, ref environment, timeout. Option D timeout, for each, environment data, ref environment, timeout. The correct answer is C timeout, find in map, environment data, ref environment, timeout. Here is why. FN find in map uses the mapping name, the selected top-level environment key, and the second-level timeout key to return the configured value. Why are the other options not correct? A. Get ATT reads attributes from resources. B. Select chooses an item from a list by index. D. For each expands repeated template fragments and is not a mapping lookup. Exam tip. Use find in map for environment-specific constants stored in CloudFormation mappings. Question number 465. Two accounts in the same organization need to use the same advanced tier systems manager. Parameter store parameters. The parameters must remain in the owning account and the consumer should not assume a role for every retrieval. Which solution has the least operational overhead? Option A is store the values in a shared S3 object. Option B create long-term IAM user credentials in the owning account. Option C share the advanced parameters with the consumer account through a AWS RAM and grant the required parameter permissions. Option D duplicate each parameter into the consumer account. The correct answer is C. Share the advanced parameters with the consumer account through a AWS RAM and grant the required parameter permissions. Here is why. Parameter sharing keeps one authoritative copy and provides native cross-account access without long-term credentials or per-request role assumption. Why are the other options not correct? A. S3 duplicates the configuration mechanism. B. Long-term IAM user credentials are insecure. D. Duplication creates synchronization overhead. Exam tip. Advanced parameter store parameters can be shared cross-account through a AWS RAM. Question number 466. An existing application authenticates users with a Cognito user pool. A new API gateway. REST API must validate those user pool tokens with minimal custom code. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A, create an API key and usage plan. Option B, configure an API gateway Cognito user pool authorizer and identify the request header that contains the token. Option C, write a Lambda token authorizer that recreates Cognito token validation. Option D, write a Lambda request authorizer that calls the Cognito API for every request. The correct answer is B, configure an API gateway Cognito user pool authorizer and identify the request header that contains the token. Here is why. The native authorizer validates Cognito user pool JWTs without custom authentication code and can be attached directly to REST API methods. Why are the other options not correct? A. API keys provide metering and usage control, not user authentication. C. A Lambda token authorizer duplicates native Cognito validation. D. Calling Cognito from a Lambda authorizer adds latency and development effort. Exam tip. Use the REST API Cognito authorizer when clients already authenticate through a Cognito user pool. Question number 467. Several zip-based Lambda functions need the same reusable library. The library should be packaged once and attached to the functions without introducing another runtime service. Which solution is most operationally efficient? Option A, publish the zip content as a Lambda layer and attach a layer version to each function. Option B, store the zip in S3 and configure Python or Node.js import paths to the S3 object. Option C, create a separate Lambda function and synchronously invoke it for every library call. Option D, convert all functions to one shared container base image. The correct answer is A, publish the zip content as a Lambda layer and attach a layer version to each function. Here is why. Layers package reusable libraries once, are versioned independently, and can be attached to multiple zip-based Lambda functions. Why are the other options not correct? B. Lambda runtimes do not import modules directly from an S3 zip. C. A synchronous helper function adds latency, cost, and failure coupling. D. Container images could share a base but require repackaging every function. Exam tip. Use Lambda layers for shared dependencies across multiple zip-based functions. Question number 468. A managed application uses KMS keys with imported key material. When a data protection period ends, the company must make the key cryptographically unusable immediately while continuing to use the highly available KMS service. Which action meets the requirement? Option A, schedule an AWS managed key for immediate deletion. Option B, delete the imported key material from the customer managed KMS key. Option C, delete AWS generated key material from a standard customer managed key. Option D, create a Cloud HSM custom key store and bypass the KMS deletion waiting period. The correct answer is B, delete the imported key material from the customer managed KMS key. Here is why. Removing imported material immediately makes the KMS key unusable for cryptographic operations while KMS continues to manage the key resource. Why are the other options not correct? A. AWS managed keys cannot be scheduled for immediate deletion. C. AWS generated key material cannot be manually deleted this way. D. A custom key store does not remove the KMS deletion waiting period. Exam tip. Imported key material can be deleted immediately to disable cryptographic use of the key. Question number 469. An Aurora Reader endpoint has multiple replicas, but new application connections continue to resolve to the same replica while another replica receives no traffic. Which application change addresses the imbalance? Option A, enable longer application DNS caching. Option B, enable connection pooling without changing DNS behavior. Option C, disable connection pooling only. Option D, disable or sharply reduce application level DNS caching so new connections can resolve different reader instances. The correct answer is D, disable or sharply reduce application level DNS caching so new connections can resolve different reader instances. Here is why. Aurora Reader endpoints distribute new connections through DNS responses. Caching one resolved address can keep directing connections to the same replica. Why are the other options not correct? A. Longer caching reinforces the imbalance. B. A pool can retain connections to one resolved replica. C. Disabling pooling alone does not help if DNS still returns a cached address. Exam tip. Keep Aurora endpoint DNS caching short and create multiple connections when reader load distribution is required. Question number 470. An Elastic Beanstalk release must preserve availability and send a configured percentage of production requests to the new application version during an evaluation window before full cutover. Which deployment policy meets the requirement? Option A. Rolling. Option B. Traffic splitting. Option C. All at once. Option D. Immutable without a traffic evaluation percentage. The correct answer is B. Traffic splitting. Here is why. Elastic Beanstalk creates the new version on separate instances, routes a specified percentage of traffic during evaluation, and shifts all traffic after successful health checks. Why are the other options not correct? A. Rolling deploys by instance batches rather than a client traffic percentage. C. All at once causes a service interruption. D. Immutable preserves availability but does not provide the requested evaluation traffic split. Exam tip. Use Elastic Beanstalk traffic splitting for managed canary-style application deployments. Question number 471. A Lambda function must send HTTP post requests to an internal service running on EC2 in private VPC subnets in the same account. Which configuration provides network connectivity? Option A. Add the function's changing IP address to a VPC route table. Option B. Create a VPN attachment for the Lambda function. Option C. Configure the function for the VPC by selecting suitable private subnets and security groups. Option D. Attach an interface endpoint directly to the Lambda function. The correct answer is C. Configure the function for the VPC by selecting suitable private subnets and security groups. Here is why. VPC attachment creates Lambda-managed network interfaces in the selected subnets, allowing the function to reach private EC2 addresses subject to routing and security group rules. Why are the other options not correct? A. Lambda does not provide a stable function IP for route table entries. B. No VPN is required for resources in the same VPC environment. D. A VPC endpoint connects to supported services, not arbitrary private EC2 applications. Exam tip. Attach Lambda to VPC subnets and security groups when it must reach private VPC resources. Question number 472. A DynamoDB index is organized by date. An application must read all items for the previous day while consuming the least read capacity, then generate and export reports. Which operation should the application use? Option A. Query the index with the previous day's partition key value. Option B. Scan the table and filter by date. Option C. Call batch getItem without knowing every primary key. Option D. Call getItem once for the date. The correct answer is A. Query the index with the previous day's partition key value. Here is why. Query reads only items in the specified date key partition, consuming less read capacity than examining the full table. Why are the other options not correct? B. Scan reads every evaluated item before filtering. C. Batch getItem requires the complete primary keys of the requested items. D. GetItem retrieves only one item by its full primary key. Exam tip. Use query instead of scan when an index key represents the required date range or group. Question number 473. Orders arrive in an SQS queue before each order is delivered to an existing fulfillment target. A managed integration must invoke enrichment logic. The team wants the least custom orchestration code. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Operate an EMR cluster and write enriched files to S3. Option B. Subscribe a Lambda polling function to SNS even though SQS is the source. Option C, build a step functions workflow and use a custom event bridge rule to detect SQS messages. Option D, create an event bridge pipe with the SQS queue as source, an enrichment step, and the fulfillment system as target. The correct answer is D, create an event bridge pipe with the SQS queue as source, an enrichment step, and the fulfillment system as target. Here is why. Event bridge pipes provides managed polling, optional enrichment, filtering, and target delivery without a custom orchestration application. Why are the other options not correct? A. EMR is excessive for per-order message enrichment. B. The design does not connect the existing SQS source correctly. C. Event bridge rules do not consume SQS messages directly in this pattern, and the workflow adds components. Exam tip. Use event bridge pipes for point-to-point integrations that require filtering or enrichment between a supported source and target. Question number 474. On-premises applications expose high-volume audit events through an HTTP endpoint. The company needs scheduled ingestion into a managed audit store where the events can be queried without operating database or search clusters. Which solution is most operationally efficient? Option A, export the events to S3 and load them into RDS. Option B, schedule a Lambda function with Event Bridge to fetch the endpoint and ingest the events into CloudTrail Lake for querying. Option C, use DataSync as an HTTP API client and query the copied data with Athena. Option D, install the CloudWatch agent solely to call the HTTP endpoint. The correct answer is B, schedule a Lambda function with Event Bridge to fetch the endpoint and ingest the events into CloudTrail Lake for querying. Here is why. The scheduled serverless collector can call the HTTP endpoint, and CloudTrail Lake custom integrations provide managed retention and SQL querying of external audit events. Why are the other options not correct? A. RDS adds database ingestion and administration. C. DataSync does not retrieve logs from a generic HTTP API. The CloudWatch agent collects supported host files and metrics. It is not a generic scheduled HTTP ingestion client. Exam tip. CloudTrail Lake custom integrations ingest external audit activity through put audit events for managed querying. Question number 475. A data firehose delivery stream receives records containing identifiers that match a known pattern. The identifiers must be removed before the transformed records are delivered to S3. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A, deliver records to EC2 first and run a custom redaction server. Option B, deliver records to OpenSearch, replace the identifiers, and export the index to S3. Option C, enable firehose data transformation with Lambda and use S3 as the delivery destination. Option D, configure a step function state machine as the firehose destination. The correct answer is C, enable firehose data transformation with Lambda and use S3 as the delivery destination. Here is why. Firehose invokes the transformation function on record batches before delivering the redacted output to the configured S3 bucket. Why are the other options not correct? A. An EC2 redaction tier adds server operations and is not a firehose destination. B. OpenSearch is unnecessary and export is not the direct transformation path. D. Step functions is not a firehose delivery destination. Exam tip. Use Lambda data transformation when firehose records require validation, conversion, enrichment, or redaction before delivery. Question number 476. A frequently updated Elastic Beanstalk web environment must preserve full production capacity and maximize availability while a new version is deployed. A failed deployment must leave the original instances untouched. Which deployment policy best meets the requirement? Option A, immutable. Option B, all at once. Option C, rolling. Option D, a deployment policy named Canary. The correct answer is A, immutable. Here is why. An immutable deployment launches a complete new auto-scaling group while the old environment remains available. Failed health checks terminate the new group and leave the original instances unchanged. Why are the other options not correct? B. All at once is fastest but temporarily removes all instances from service. C. Rolling reduces available capacity while each batch is updated. D. Canary is not the elastic beanstalk deployment policy name. Traffic splitting is the managed canary policy. Exam tip. Choose immutable when preserving capacity and safe rollback are more important than deployment speed. Question number 477. An API gateway REST API invokes a Lambda function infrequently, sometimes with several simultaneous requests. The handler is already optimized, but initialization latency must be reduced. Which configuration should the developer use? Option A. Add API gateway response caching. Option B. Use Lambda proxy integration. Option C. Put global accelerator in front of the function. Option D. Configure provision concurrency on a published version or alias. The correct answer is D. Configure provision concurrency on a published version or alias. Here is why. Provision concurrency keeps the configured number of execution environments initialized and ready, reducing cold start latency during simultaneous requests. Why are the other options not correct? A. API caching can avoid some invocations but does not optimize function initialization. B. Proxy integration changes request handling, not execution environment startup. C. Global accelerator does not directly front or pre-initialize Lambda. Exam tip. Use provision concurrency for predictable Lambda initialization latency. Question number 478. An API gateway REST API's development stage uses a stage variable to select the Lambda alias dev. The same API must expose the prod alias through a separate production endpoint. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Add a method named production to the development stage. Option B. Change one development stage integration request to invoke prod. Option C. Deploy the API to a production stage and set that stage's variable to the prod alias. Option D. Add a production method whose method name contains the alias. The correct answer is C. Deploy the API to a production stage and set that stage's variable to the prod alias. Here is why. Separate stages provide independent endpoints and stage variable values. The shared integration URI can resolve the alias specified by each stage. Why are the other options not correct? A. HTTP methods represent verbs, not deployment environments. B. Changing the development integration would not create a production endpoint. D. Method names do not select Lambda aliases. Exam tip. Use API gateway stages and stage variables to route the same API definition to environment-specific Lambda aliases. Question number 479. A SaaS vendor deploys dedicated EC2 and RDS test infrastructure into many customer AWS accounts. Before every release, one continuous delivery workflow must provision the multi-account stacks and run integration tests on the created resources with minimal administration. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Use code deploy in stacksets for infrastructure, then use code guru to execute tests. Option B. Use code pipeline to orchestrate CloudFormation stacksets deployment and code build integration tests. Option C. Use one account CloudFormation change sets and a custom resource to execute tests. Option D. Use SAM change sets to deploy EC2 and RDS, then use code deploy as the test runner. The correct answer is B. Use code pipeline to orchestrate CloudFormation stacksets deployment and code build integration tests. Here is why. Code pipeline coordinates the release, stacksets provisions consistent infrastructure across customer accounts, and code build runs repeatable integration tests against the deployed resources. Why are the other options not correct? A. Code deploy deploys application revisions, and code guru is not the general integration test runner. C. Change sets do not natively manage the same stack across many accounts, and custom resources are poor test runners. D. SAM targets serverless resources, while code deploy does not execute integration tests. Exam tip. Combine code pipeline, stack sets, and code build for multi-account infrastructure delivery followed by automated tests. Question number 480. An ECS task consumes messages from an SQS standard queue. The task should minimize SQS API requests and avoid frequent empty responses. Which two actions are most cost-effective? Choose 2. Option A. Use short polling. Option B. Use long polling. Option C. Add elastic cache as a second message cache. Option D. Receive messages in batches. E. Replace the standard queue with FIFO only to reduce polling cost. The correct answer is B. Use long polling. D. Receive messages in batches. Here is why. Long polling reduces empty receive message responses, and batching retrieves multiple messages per API request, lowering request cost and network overhead. Why are the other options not correct? A. Short polling produces more empty responses and requests. C. Caching queue messages introduces another service without reducing correct SQS consumption. E. FIFO is for ordering and deduplication, not lower polling cost. Exam tip. Combine SQS long polling and batch receive/delete operations for efficient container consumers. Question number 481. A retail application stores catalog data in an RDS for MySQL database. Product pages frequently request the same list of trending items, and the team wants a managed in-memory cache in front of the relational database. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Add a standby DB instance and direct read requests to the standby endpoint. Option B. Place a DAX cluster in front of the RDS database and use the DAX endpoint. Option C. Create an elastic cache for readISS cache and update the application to read and write cached product data through the readISS endpoint. Option D. Add a cache node directly to the RDS cluster and replace the database endpoint with the cache endpoint. The correct answer is C. Create an elastic cache for readISS cache and update the application to read and write cached product data through the readISS endpoint. Here is why. Elastic cache provides a managed in-memory cache that an RDS-backed application can use for frequently requested relational data. Why are the other options not correct? A. A standby instance provides high availability and is not a readable application cache. B. DAX is compatible with DynamoDB, not RDS-D. RDS does not support attaching a generic cache node and replacing its endpoint. Exam tip. Use elastic cache for application caching in front of relational databases. Use DAX for DynamoDB compatible caching. Question number 482. An application publishes promotional notifications through an SNS FIFO topic. The operations team needs the most operationally efficient way to inspect notification throughput and end-to-end delivery latency. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Enable active tracing for the SNS topic and analyze the topic and subscription paths with AWS X-ray. Option B. Review only the CloudWatch number of notifications failed metric. Option C. Enable guard duty runtime monitoring for the topic. Option D. Analyze cloud trail records for SNS management API calls. The correct answer is A. Enable active tracing for the SNS topic and analyze the topic and subscription paths with AWS X-ray. Here is why. SNS active tracing supports FIFO topics and exposes request rate, service map paths, and delivery latency for traced publishers and subscribers. Why are the other options not correct? B. Failed notification count does not measure successful rate or end-to-end latency. C. Guard duty detects threats rather than messaging performance. D. Cloud trail records API activity, not notification delivery latency. Exam tip. Enable SNS active tracing when an event-driven path needs request-level latency and dependency analysis. Question number 483. A step function's order workflow must pause until another service writes a matching confirmation item to DynamoDB. The workflow can periodically check for the item and should continue when it appears. Which state machine design meets the requirement? Option A. Start one Lambda invocation that continuously polls DynamoDB until the item appears or the function reaches its timeout. Option B. Stop the existing execution when a stream record arrives and start the workflow again from its beginning. Option C, use a DynamoDB getItem service integration, branch on whether the item exists, and use a wait state before repeating the check. Option D, use DynamoDB streams to call the step function's redrive command on the running execution. The correct answer is C, use a DynamoDB getItem service integration, branch on whether the item exists, and use a wait state before repeating the check. Here is why. The state machine remains durable while wait consumes no Lambda runtime, and the loop continues only until the confirmation item becomes available. Why are the other options not correct? A. Continuous Lambda polling wastes runtime and can time out. B. Restarting loses the current workflow state. D. Redrive restarts failed executions and is not a callback for a running wait state. Exam tip. Use service integrations, choice, and wait states for durable polling when a callback token pattern is unavailable. Question number 484. Users upload confidential documents to S3. The plaintext must be encrypted before it reaches S3, and only the user who controls the private key should be able to decrypt it. Which encryption approach meets the requirement? Option A, use dual-layer server-side encryption with KMS keys. Option B, use client-side encryption with the S3 encryption client and a raw RSA wrapping key, whose private key remains on the user's device. Option C, use server-side encryption with S3 managed keys. Option D, use server-side encryption with KMS keys. The correct answer is B, use client-side encryption with the S3 encryption client and a raw RSA wrapping key whose private key remains on the user's device. Here is why. The document is encrypted before upload, and S3 or other third parties cannot recover plaintext without the user-controlled private key. Why are the other options not correct? A. DSSEKMS is still server-side encryption performed after S3 receives the object. C. SSS3 leaves key control with S3. D. SSEKMS provides stronger server-side key control but AWS services still perform the decryption path for authorized callers. Exam tip. Choose client-side encryption when plaintext must remain unavailable to the storage service and only the client controls decryption keys. Question number 485. A mobile application needs native user registration and sign-in. After authentication, users must receive temporary AWS credentials that authorize access to selected backend resources. Which solution meets both requirements? Option A, use only an IAM role attached to API gateway. Option B, create a Cognito user pool for sign-up and sign-in, then connect it to a Cognito identity pool that exchanges authenticated identities for role credentials. Option C, use only a Cognito user pool and embed permanent AWS keys in the app. Option D, use IAM Access Analyzer as the mobile identity provider. The correct answer is B, create a Cognito user pool for sign-up and sign-in, then connect it to a Cognito identity pool that exchanges authenticated identities for role credentials. Here is why. The user pool provides application authentication, and the identity pool provides temporary AWS credentials for authorized backend access. Why are the other options not correct? A. API gateway roles do not provide mobile user registration. C. A user pool alone does not vend AWS credentials. D. Access Analyzer is not an application identity provider. Exam tip. Combine user pools for authentication with identity pools when users need AWS credentials. Question number 486. Several Lambda functions write objects to one S3 bucket. One function has unusually slow S3 calls, and the developer needs to measure latency specifically on the dependency path between that function and S3. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A, calculate the average Lambda at duration value with CloudWatch Logs Insights. Option B, enable Lambda Insights and use only its function-level duration graph. Option C, enable X-ray tracing and inspect the edge between the Lambda service node and the S3 service node in the trace map. Option D, select S3 from a CloudWatch metrics latency histogram. The correct answer is C, enable X-ray tracing and inspect the edge between the Lambda service node and the S3 service node in the trace map. Here is why. The traced edge isolates downstream S3 call latency from the function's total duration and shows request level dependency timing. Why are the other options not correct? A. At duration measures the entire invocation. B. Lambda Insights focuses on function and runtime telemetry rather than one downstream service edge. D. S3 is not selected from a generic CloudWatch latency histogram for this trace path. Exam tip. Inspect X-ray edges or subsegments when latency must be attributed to one downstream dependency. Question number 487. An application includes an Amazon DynamoDB table that is named orders. The table has a primary partition key of ID and a global secondary index, GSI, that is named an account index. The GSI has a partition key of accountd and a sort key of order date time. A developer needs to create an AWS Lambda function to retrieve the orders that have an accountd of 100. Which solution will meet this requirement by using the least read capacity? Option A. Define a DynamoDB API request for the getItem action with the following parameters. Table name. Orders. Key. Account ID. 100. SS. Option B. Define a DynamoDB API request for the batch getItem action with the following parameters. Request items. Orders. Keys. Account ID. 100. S. Option C. Define a DynamoDB API request for the scan action with the following parameters. Table name. Orders. Index NM. Account index. Filter expression. Account ID. UNT ID. Expression attribute values. Rackount I. 100. SS. Option D. Define a DynamoDB API request for the query action with the following parameters. Table name. Orders. Index name. Account index. Key condition expression. Accounted. CC UNT ID. Expression attribute values. Rackount I. 100. SS. The correct answer is D. Use the query action on the account index GSI with account ID equals account ID. Here is why. The GSI uses account ID as its partition key. A query operation can directly retrieve all index items whose account ID equals 100, consuming read capacity only for the matching key range rather than reading the entire index. Why are the other options not correct? A. GetItem requires the base table's primary key, ID. It cannot retrieve multiple items by a GSI partition key. B. Batch GetItem also requires the complete base table primary key for every requested item and cannot query a GSI. C. Scan reads every item in the index before applying the filter, so it consumes more read capacity. Exam tip. Use query when the required value is a table or index partition key. Use scan only when no suitable key-based access path exists. Question number 488. A DynamoDB gaming table uses country_code as its partition key. Most new users now come from one country, and requests for that single key are being throttled even though the table has available aggregate capacity. What should the developer change? Option A. Replace the key design with a higher cardinality value that distributes users across more partition key values. Option B. Use strongly consistent reads for all requests. Option C. Replace query operations with scan operations. Option D. Paginate responses to reduce the stored item size. The correct answer is A. Replace the key design with a higher cardinality value that distributes users across more partition key values. Here is why. Country is a low cardinality key. Concentrating one country's traffic on a small key space creates hot partitions and throughput exceptions. Why are the other options not correct? B. Strong consistency consumes more read capacity. C. Scan increases work and does not correct write or key distribution. D. Pagination controls response pages, not physical partition distribution or item size. Exam tip. Design DynamoDB partition keys for high cardinality and even traffic distribution. You have completed part 12 of the DVA-C02 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.